All right, well, thank you everybody so much for joining us for today's Global Employability Expert Series. My name is Jessica Rakowski, and I'm a University Partnerships Manager at Virtual Internships. So today we're going to be learning about cross-cultural communication in today's workplace. And our guest speaker today is Wendy Ames-Dionisio. Sorry, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but
good. That was good.
She is currently the Director of Donor Relations at Green Hill Humane Society in Eugene, Oregon, and is trained as a cultural anthropologist. So I will now pass it over to Wendy to introduce herself and have her provide her insights to us today.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be talking with you this morning. And it's kind of ironic that we're talking about cross-cultural, intercultural communication, and that's exactly what this Zoom session is. So we're practicing what we preach in the moment, and that's kind of interesting and exciting too. And technology kind of adds a whole different set of challenges and elements to that. Which could be another webinar. But anyway, just wanted to point out that we're in the midst of it, and that's kind of exciting. My background is in advertising and marketing as an undergrad, and my graduate degree, my master's degree, is in cultural anthropology. So most of my career, I've done a mix of research, marketing, and communications. And I currently work in fundraising, which actually puts all that together for a nonprofit organization or charity. So couple of examples that I wanted to share with you of my own cross-cultural experience kind of on the ground, and where I had a lot of learning and a lot of mistakes along the way was studying abroad. So as an undergrad, I studied abroad in France. And then I went to Japan after college to teach for 3 years, 2 different sessions of a year and a half each. And then I went to graduate school and I studied anthropology, as I mentioned. And so we were required to learn a second foreign language and do research. I chose to do my research in Indonesia, and I did research there on a Fulbright scholarship. So that was the background that got me ready for cross-cultural workplace engagement. And since all of those studies and research experiences, I've worked for the University of Oregon, recruiting international students to an English language program. And that took me to Brazil, China, all around the US, and I met a lot of people at embassies and consulates. So we were here in the US, but in an environment which required diplomacy and cross-cultural experience. I also did research, market research, for a corporate qualitative research firm named Ipsos. You may have heard of them. They do studies all over the world. And that took me to many countries across the globe and a lot of different cultural environments and socioeconomic environments here in the United States, where I would be tasked with the job of just kind of learning what makes people tick. And that information was used for communication planning, product development, and marketing. So there are other examples. I work for nonprofits now, and we have some engagement that requires talking across cultures and belief systems. But I can leave that for the Q&A if you want to hear any more. That's just kind of a general background about my experience. Shall I go ahead and get started?
Yeah, go right ahead. Thank you for that intro.
You're welcome. So I'm going to share my screen because I have, it's about 10 slides to share to walk us through the conversation. And I would be happy to share this after, if it's useful and if people want to see it. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about intercultural communication. We throw that language around a lot. And what does it mean exactly? And really what it means is interaction, and it can be verbal or nonverbal interaction. So it's about communicating, and we study it to help us communicate effectively. And notice that the first point says across countries or cultures or lifestyles or belief systems or political leanings. So for example, in the US right now, we're in the midst of a heated presidential campaign with really strong polarization on both sides. And even that, I would argue, could be considered an intercultural communication challenge. For example, if a very left-wing liberal and a very right-wing conservative are trying to talk about the election, or maybe even talk about something else and avoid the conversation of the election, this can present challenges that are similar when people try to communicate across cultures, for example, from France to Japan. So I want to point that out. It can also be across religious lines, sexual orientation, educational choices, educational levels, socioeconomic status. So there are many ways that we in our daily lives communicate interculturally. It's not only an international task or event or challenge. And why do we bother? Why do we want to study intercultural communication? Why is it useful to have a webinar such as this? Well, we're living in a really global world, and diversity, equity, and inclusion has become a more common terminology and thought process, and something that we prioritize in our lives. And in order to be competent at that, we want to learn how to communicate across these various belief systems and cultural leanings. You want to try to prepare yourself to be a global citizen and to have the skills of diplomacy and respect when you engage people who are different than you. And that will help you in all aspects of your education and career. So how do we start? That's always the question. So step one, right? Step one is commit to it. Commit to lifelong learning, self-reflection, self-assessment. That means even people who are considered experts, people who are teaching this, they have to commit. We have to commit to a constant process of reflecting on our beliefs, our behaviors, our speech, our actions, and making sure that we're being sensitive and respectful to others. It's not something that you just learn and you check off that box and you're done. It's really something you have to keep working on throughout your lifetime. Social things change, cultural things change, and we have to change with it and learn and grow. Another thing you can do right now as a step toward this is just engage with a variety of people, media, literature, music. A lot of people say they like to be around like-minded people. That can be very comforting and a positive thing when you need it. You can have certain groups or situations where you engage in like-minded conversations. But I would also challenge you to engage in conversations and situations where you're not with like-minded people, because that helps you flex those muscles of patience and listening and understanding, and it may help you grow and expand your thinking. If you don't change your thinking, that might be okay too, but you may learn better ways just to show respect and be a great listener. So that's the last point: listen, observe, and be respectful. A little background on intercultural communication. An American anthropologist, Edward T. Hall, is kind of known as the pioneering father of intercultural communication. He wrote this book that I show the cover of on this slide called The Silent Language in 1959. It was really a landmark piece of work. And it was used in the 60s and 70s for Peace Corps volunteer training. So it really helped people understand how communication, and especially nonverbal communication, can impact our ways of interacting with other human beings. This all led to research that changed anthropology also, because anthropology at that time was more of a let's study this culture and deconstruct it, or let's compare culture A to culture B. And what Hall was looking at is let's look at interactions between people and people of different cultures or different belief systems and see what that teaches us about culture and society. So it was ever changing and led to the field of study, which is now called intercultural communication. So a step back, let's just think about what is culture exactly. Sometimes that word is used in a really general way, and we're not even sure what it exactly means. It is a little hard to define because it's pretty all-encompassing. So you can see some of the examples here. Some of them may be obvious, like I've written art and music and language and things like that. And some of it may be not so obvious, like influencers. What has influenced you in your life? What have you been taught? What do you know and what do you not know about? What are some of your key experiences and what do you expect from life, from other people? What are your behaviors and speech like, and how are they different from others, and how are they the same as others that are around you? Think about your boundaries, your taboos, your no-nos. What are some things that you would never say? Sorry, I'm going to turn off my sound there. What are some things that you would never say? What are some things you would absolutely never do? What are some things you would be absolutely shocked if someone in your family said or did? That all informs us about what is your culture. Also, like I said, art and music, but think of government, politics, education, universities, K through 12 education. That also informs us about our culture. Humor and teasing. There are things in one culture that could be considered absolutely hilarious, and in another culture, completely inappropriate. And this is something we have to watch out for when we travel, when we engage people from other cultures, if we work globally or on global teams. Be careful with teasing and with jokes. It's good to be making fun of yourself rather than others, because that can be pretty safe and pretty funny and harmless. And you want to kind of listen and observe and see what people find funny or not. You can also learn about that sometimes from media. But media tends to push the boundaries, so be cautious with that. And then there's all the nonverbal stuff, gestures, expressions, etc. Smiling versus frowning, hand gestures and motions, body language, the way we sit, the way we stand, how close we stand to other people, how close we are when talking. So much of that has changed with the COVID-19 pandemic. So it'll be interesting to see how things unfold as it wraps up. I wanted to mention culture shock. Totally okay, totally expected that we will experience culture shock. And it's really just a phase of adjustment that tends to be quite temporary. Some people take longer than others to adjust, but it is something that heals over time. Often you can identify your culture shock by feelings of anxiety, frustration, confusion. We get really critical when we're experiencing culture shock. So let's say we stay with a host family and move to another country. The thought's always in our mind, why did they do that? Why are they eating that? Yuck, why did they say it that way? We get judgy, right? And quite critical. And a lot of times that's just our own discomfort with trying to adjust to a new situation. Over time, we can just start to perhaps name differences, but without feeling so much judgment or stress about them. If you do find yourself going through culture shock, which if you work globally and study globally, I'm sure it will happen at some point, just try to recognize it. And my first piece of advice is bullet point 3, just stop talking and do more listening and more observing. That's the best thing you can do, because when we're in a negative space, a critical space, we don't want to do a lot of talking. We want to take in information. If you need to talk though, find someone to talk to, like a trusted source, maybe a friend that's not living there and not in that situation, who can just be a neutral third party. Or maybe a friend that is in the situation, but you can just speak privately and share your frustrations without offending or hurting other people's feelings. You can also go to counseling, talk to a school counselor or a therapist if that helps you. Get help if you need it. The adjustment period can be long. They say 6 months to a year if you move abroad. So it can be taxing and tiring, and it's always good to reach out. And be patient with yourself and with those around you, because it will pass. So I'm not going to go over all the details in the next 3 slides. You'll see they're jam-packed, but I just wanted to give this as an example of American culture, some of the aspects or qualities that people tend to associate with American culture. If you're an American, some of these might feel recognizable and some of them don't. If you're not, you might say, yes, I've noticed that. Yes, I see that. So it's just interesting to look at these points. I will say they're not 100% true all the time. So America is a very diverse place. The United States is a total chili soup of people from different places, different backgrounds, different belief systems. Even 2 people with British heritage can have very different ways of life, different religions, different families, etc. So we can't just throw these labels on people and say, all Americans are like this. But what these qualities and factors list are some general ideas about how people around the globe tend to experience American culture. And I think it's fair to frame it that way. So Americans tend to be quite competitive, and you might be surprised to hear them being kind of braggy. And that's something that is appreciated and held up as positive in the United States. People tend to find Americans quite informal. We use first names a lot. I know at some of the public schools in my community, the principal is called by first name. You walk down the hall and they're like, "Hi, Mary. How's it going, Jack? What's up?" So there's a lot of informality, which can be surprising to people that are coming from other places that are a little more formal. Privacy. Americans tend to like alone time and a lot of privacy. They can also be extremely social, but for example, we don't tend to stop by people's houses unannounced for anything more than like a drop off or a quick hello. We don't come and sit down in their living room and ask for a cup of coffee and visit without scheduling it or checking in first. So there's a little bit of an element of privacy in American culture. Friendship. Americans in general tend to be very friendly, and friendships can cross the boundaries of work and school and other more formal environments. So there's a lot of friendliness and a lot of talk about personal life and family. Understanding American culture is something that I put here because I think there's this way that we label, but then there's also this way that we can look at things like values. And this can come up in the workplace, it can come up in the classroom, and it's a pretty certain list, I think, of ways that the culture in the United States is, it defines itself, let's say that. So for example, time. Time is money, don't waste it, be on time, stick to the schedule. If the meeting starts at 9, show up at 9. That just tends to be something that's highly valued in the American education system and workplace. And it will serve you very well if you can be one of those people who shows up early or on time. Communication. Americans tend to value assertiveness and frankness. This can be really hard for people that are introverts because introverts tend to hold their thoughts and feelings a little tighter and do a kind of a wait and see approach. And it's really valued in American culture to speak your mind. So this can be a challenge, and extroverts tend to have it a little easier than introverts in the beginning. But there's a lot of recent writing about the power and amazing qualities of an introvert. So either way, it's okay. It's just good to know that this is valued in American culture and how you'll navigate it personally, depending on your personality and your own cultural background. Individualism. People tend to talk a lot about American individualism. I have a mixed bag on this one because I do see that a lot, but I also see a real community spirit of giving and philanthropy. As I mentioned, I work in donor relations for a humane society. We recently had horrible wildfires in Oregon, and it was just astounding how the community all over the state and actually across the US, which is unusual for our donor base, came together to give money and supplies and food for animals that were affected and evacuated from the fires. So I think there's a mix in American culture of a strong individual identity that is strong, but there's also an embracement of philanthropy and community generosity. And I would add that to this bullet point. So I want to talk a little bit about the workplace and some of the things that you'll experience. Everything so far is relevant, but this list is quite specific. So I kind of did an uh-oh. So now I'm going to work. Now I've got a job. I have a global team. What are some of the things that I'm going to find challenging? And this is a list. So everything from how we greet, saying hello, handshaking, how formal or informal it is, whether or not we bow, those kinds of things, dress code and how we should look in the office, attitudes about time we just talked about, how hierarchy works, what communication protocols are and how meetings are run, the way we negotiate and make decisions, the way we solve problems or create strategy, how do we resolve disagreements? That can be really tricky, even in your own culture. Now try doing it cross-culturally. How do we deliver presentations? What's our facial expression? What is our body language? How loud should we be? What kind of tech should we use? That can all be influenced by culture and workplace culture. Giving gifts or not, is that appropriate at the office? Wait and find out before you do it, or ask someone. How do we build trust? Do we socialize with our coworkers? Are they going to be our friends or not? Again, tricky stuff to figure out in the workplace. So I was going to open this up to questions, but I wanted to share two personal examples of ways that I've really messed up in cross-cultural communication over time. So I mentioned that I studied in France as an undergrad, and after I graduated from college, I moved to Japan and taught English. Teachers in Japan are highly revered, treated incredibly respectfully, constantly given gifts, taken out to dinner by their classes, etc. It was really an honor to be an English teacher in Japan, and people were so generous and so respectful. So we often went out after class for dinner or appetizers or drinks or that sort of thing. And when I lived in France as a student, I learned, instead of saying cheers with my glass, that you would say chin chin. And chin chin is said in France and Italy, and it's the equivalent of cheers. So chin chin with your glass of wine or water or whatever. So when I went to Japan and people were having beers or wine and doing a cheers, I said chin chin, and the entire table laughed hysterically at me, and I wasn't sure what was going on. And it turns out that I discovered that chin chin is a slang for male genitalia. It's sort of similar to the English term wee wee. So incredibly embarrassing, unbelievable cross-cultural faux pas, but I learned my lesson. And now during the first cheers in any country, I wait and listen and see what other people say before I speak. Second example, roar. When I took my son, he's now 17, but at the time he was 6, to Indonesia. He has very dark hair and pale skin like his mama. And the people in Indonesia were just fascinated by this combination of white skin and dark hair, and they always wanted to touch him. So everywhere we went, they would touch his hair and touch his face and speak about his qualities. And he really disliked this. He didn't like being touched. We don't tend to do that in American culture unless we know people. We don't touch them, especially their head and face. And so he didn't know what to do. He was only 6. He couldn't speak the language. So he just started roaring like a tiger every time someone touched his head. And that made people laugh. It was actually an excellent step for a 6-year-old. No one was offended, and everyone kind of got a kick out of his creative reaction. So a negative and a positive example from my own experience. And I just want to open it up now. If you have a story to share, if you'd like to talk about the workplace, or any other questions that you might have.
Thank you, Wendy. That was super interesting and fascinating. You know, I love learning about these kinds of studies, and I think it's really important too, even for students who, and you know, people as they get into their future career who may not think that they're entering into a global workplace. But as you mentioned, some of those things like your politics, even, and your personality and your expectations, that can also affect your cross-cultural communication. So thank you for sharing. You're very welcome. That. Yeah, and as Wendy said, if anybody has any questions or any personal stories that they would like to share, please enter them into the Q&A section. Maybe to get the ball rolling a little bit, I do have a question that I'd like to ask you. So I think that as a lot of our interns are from all over the world, and they're working with companies that are also from all over the world. One thing that they may be facing is not just, you know, a struggle with intercultural communication, but maybe intergenerational communication. So if they're working with companies with a different hierarchical structure than what they're used to, whether it's more strict and formal or more informal. Is that something that you've come across in your, you know, studies, and do you have any advice for how to kind of navigate that?
Yes, I have. I have come across that, especially when I worked at the University of Oregon, which is a government organization, and jobs are very union protected. So you have, it's also, they're very good jobs. It's a great employer and a pleasant place to work. So you often get hired in new, and you're working side by side with someone who's been there for 20 years. And that in itself can just cause a lot of disruption for them and a lot of frustration for you, because you're wanting to change and they're wanting to be respected for the foundation that they've established. I also experienced it when I worked in corporate marketing, and we had branding teams and people of all ages and backgrounds, and they were global teams. So we also had culture and language to deal with. So I went back to this initial slide at the bottom. I would say these 3 points really are the go-to for every challenge that you're facing. And it's a commitment to learning, reflection, and assessment of your own self. Engaging all the time with a variety of people. You don't want your world to be so closed that one person that seems different is like an annoyance to you, right? You want to constantly have people in your life. Even if you're just watching shows, reading literature, maybe you don't have the opportunity to meet all kinds of people in the town you live in, or in the classes that you take, or in the job that you have, but you certainly have art and media to help you with that. And I think that immersion in diversity helps you to be more accepting when things do come your way that are different, including generational differences. And then again, listen, observe, and be respectful. We all want that, right? Don't we all want to feel like someone is listening to us and actually respects what we say, even if they don't agree with us, even if we're not the smartest person in the room, but we all just want to feel respected in that way. And that is really the first step to building trust in a workplace with any other person or colleague.
Got it. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any other questions, surprisingly.
Okay. Are we sure? Nothing that you want to ask?
Let's give it maybe another minute, see if anybody has any last minute questions.
Also, if you have any stories to share, I mean, most of you are engaged in some level of intercultural work. I shared my Chin Chin and Roar story. Is there anything anyone else would like to share with us?
I have a similar story to that, actually. So I studied abroad in Florence, and when my sister and my mom came to visit me, we met up in Rome, and our tour guide had directed us to this little hole-in-the-wall porchetta restaurant, and it was a one-man operation. He didn't speak any English, and so we were trying to order the sandwich, and my sister and my mom were like, oh, there's nothing else on this sandwich, it's just the porchetta, like they don't put any cheese or anything on it. And so they made me ask or say formaggio, which is the Italian word for cheese. And he looked, and I repeated myself, and he started laughing, similar to your situation. It was like, no, you don't do that. You don't put that on a porchetta sandwich. So it was an embarrassing situation, because I felt almost like he had scolded us for not being aware of their culture.
So you asked for an ingredient in the sandwich that just wasn't appropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had that happen in Japan. I don't know if it was me or a friend, I can't remember now, asked for sugar for the green tea, because green tea is very bitter. And that was just a ridiculous request for that. So we learned quickly that that wasn't how you drink green tea.
Well, I'm sorry, Wendy, but it doesn't look like any other questions are coming in. But if anybody does have any questions, you can absolutely feel free to reach out to Wendy. She provided her email address right there, and I know that I linked her LinkedIn account to the promotional emails that I sent out. So if you want to connect with her on LinkedIn or reach out with any further questions, please feel free to do so. But otherwise, wait, looks like we do have a question now.
Good.
Okay, it says, thank you so much for sharing your interesting experiences with us. I wonder how a person can maintain his own beliefs, principles, and values while adapting to other cultures.
Yes. You know, that is always, I think, an internal question that we struggle with when we are trying to make bridges. And I do think intercultural work is bridge building. And so if you can think of it as a bridge rather than a surrendering, I think that's helpful. It's really just reaching out and connecting. An excellent example of this, which was recently highlighted in the media, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, US Supreme Court Justice, passed this last month, we learned that she was very close friends with Antonin Scala. And he was known as one of the most conservative US Supreme Court judges ever. And she was one of the more liberal and fought for gender equality and women's rights throughout her entire career. He was a conservative Catholic and she was Jewish. And it turns out that they spent every New Year's Eve together with their families. They traveled to various places in the world. He used to take her roses for her birthday, and they had a fabulous friendship. So politically and religiously, and maybe even on some levels, you could say of ethics, they had very different belief systems, very different approaches to the law, and a very different look at how people should conduct their daily lives in the United States. Yet they found an appreciation for one another, they respected each other, and they were truly and deeply friends. And I think it's an excellent role model for how we could do the same in our day-to-day lives and in the workplace.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a great example. I did not know that about them.
Oh yeah, you should read about it on the web. It's awesome.
It's really sweet.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we are running out of time now. So thank you again so much, Wendy, for taking the time to join us today. This was a really great presentation, and I think that our interns really learned something that they can take away and apply to their internships moving forward and their careers as well in the future.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the question. And if anyone has additional questions, my email's on the screen. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to be a resource.
Right. Thank you everyone for attending today. Please, look out for the next invitation to our next webinar series in 2 weeks. Again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.